Ever felt powerless against an overreaching authority? One day, my HOA crossed a line, literally by installing a fiber optic cable on my property, and I decided to fight back in the most unexpected way. I remember it was a cool, crisp morning, one of those rare days when you wake up with a sense of possibility, a cup of steaming coffee in hand, and a yard that promised a quiet start to the day. As I stepped out barefoot and ready to tend to my garden, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just another patch of stubborn crabgrass, but as I drew closer, I saw it clearly, a series of brightly colored markers sticking up from the freshly disturbed earth like neon party decorations that didn't belong. My heart sank as I realized these were not part of any planned landscaping project. They signaled the presence of something entirely unapproved. And that's when I discovered it, a fiber optic line, secretly and shamelessly buried across my yard by the HOA. Now, let me take you back to the day it all began. I had never been the confrontational type, always preferring to solve things with a calm conversation and a little bit of paperwork. That morning, as the sun peeked over the rooftops, I was enjoying a moment of solitude on my lawn. I was just about to give the stubborn crabgrass one final inspection when I noticed a cluster of oddly colored flags emerging from the turf. I frowned, wondering why anyone would install such markers without warning. Before I could process the situation, I heard the rumble of vehicles approaching. I stepped back in confusion as two vans, unfamiliar and unmarked by any recognizable city emblem, rolled into my driveway. Soon, a couple of men in hard hats and carrying trenching equipment began to unload their gear, their actions as efficient as they were secretive. Naturally, I walked over to ask, "Hey, what's going on here?" One of the men gave me a curt nod and replied, "Just following orders, sir," before slipping on his headphones and walking away. I couldn't help but feel that something was off. No one had contacted me, no permit had been filed, nothing that would justify someone excavating my property. Later that day, I called the HOA office, left messages, and even fired off a couple of emails. But as the hours ticked by, I received nothing in return. It wasn't until that evening, after a long day of restless waiting, that I discovered a thin, uneven trench stretching diagonally across my front lawn, a jagged scar where my once pristine grass had been haphazardly replaced. Attached to my front door was a sticky note with a brief, impersonal message, "Routine HOA infrastructure upgrade. Thank you for your understanding." I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. How could they assume I'd be okay with such an invasion of my property? Fueled by a mix of frustration and a sense of injustice, I began to dig not just into the earth, but into the mountain of paperwork that might explain, or at least legally justify, what they'd done. I combed through county records, property maps, and any utility permits I could find. To my astonishment, there was no permit, no easement, nothing that would grant the HOA the right to dig up my yard. You see, my house was one of the original model homes built long before the HOA was even established, meaning I was never bound by the same rules that governed my neighbors. I wasn't just a homeowner, I was an anomaly, a reminder that sometimes the rules simply don't apply to everyone. That night, as I sat in my living room poring over documents, my mind began to form a plan that was both calculated and delightfully rebellious. I had spent 6 years as a civil engineer before turning to freelance work, so I wasn't exactly an amateur when it came to construction and permits. Every detail of the unauthorized installation was wrong, the cable was buried too shallow, the trench was sloppy, and the entire project smacked of haste and disregard for proper procedure. It was as if someone had assumed that because I wouldn't notice, they could just go ahead and do whatever they wanted. And I wasn't about to let that slide. Over the next few days, I meticulously documented everything. I measured the depth of the trench, took high-resolution photos of the exposed cable, and even retrieved a small sample of the disturbed soil to compare with the rest of my lawn. With each piece of evidence, my resolve grew stronger. I began drafting an itemized invoice, not for damages in the traditional sense, but for the immense inconvenience and the blatant disrespect of my property rights. I calculated the cost of restoring my lawn, the potential devaluation of my property, and even factored in the risk they had imposed on the neighborhood's infrastructure. By the time I was finished, the total came to an eye-watering sum that I was convinced would make the HOA think twice before pulling such a stunt again. The next weekend, I invited a few of my close friends over under the pretense of a laid-back backyard barbecue. Little did they know this gathering had a dual purpose. As we sipped on cold beverages and fired up the grill, I casually explained the situation to them, and together we devised our next move. With a mix of camaraderie and shared determination, we transformed the backyard into a sort of DIY investigative workshop. One of my buddies even brought along a voltage tester just to confirm that the cable was indeed active and not some obsolete piece of infrastructure. And sure enough, within minutes, we had a clear picture of what we were dealing with. I distinctly recall the moment I had to face the HOA head-on. It wasn't long after our barbecue when I was carefully retracing the cable's path with red flags marking the trench that the HOA president herself arrived. Clad in a sharp, salmon-pink windbreaker and armed with a clipboard that she treated like a sacred relic, she sauntered down my sidewalk with an air of unyielding authority. "What's this about?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even. With a condescending smile, she explained that the fiber optic line was part of a neighborhood connectivity upgrade that, according to her, had been approved by everyone except me. I calmly informed her that I'd never signed on to any such agreement and that my property records clearly stated otherwise. Her smile faltered ever so slightly, but before she could respond, she hurried away, leaving me with nothing but the echo of her patronizing chuckle. At that point, I knew that talking wouldn't be enough. I needed to act and act fast. I meticulously sent one more email, this time with all the evidence attached, and then waited. For a few agonizing days, I heard nothing but continued silence from the HOA. Then, one day, a glossy envelope arrived in the mail. Inside, the HOA had included a full-page bulletin boasting about the successful upgrade of our community's internet services. They even detailed their future plans for further improvements, all while completely ignoring the fact that my property had been unlawfully altered. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had transformed a blatant error into a self-congratulatory parade of corporate jargon. I couldn't help but laugh. I decided it was time for the grand finale. With every document in my possession, I prepared for what I jokingly called my legal showdown. I printed a detailed invoice, itemizing every infraction, every unauthorized alteration, and every cent of potential property devaluation, totaling a staggering amount that I knew would force their hand. I then personally delivered the envelope, handing it over to the HOA board with a smile that belied the storm raging beneath the surface. Their reaction was priceless. The president flipped through the envelope with a mix of disbelief and indignation, her eyes darting from page to page. Before she could muster a response, I calmly stated, "I think you're going to pay me for the mess you've left on my property." Her face, usually so composed, turned a shade of red as one of the board members whispered urgently in her ear. The fallout was immediate. Within hours, word of the confrontation spread throughout the neighborhood. Neighbors who had long felt powerless under the HOA's overbearing thumb began asking questions. Soon enough, a community meeting was called, and for the first time, the collective frustration of the residents was laid bare. At the meeting, questions flew like sparks from a bonfire. Who approved this trenching? How can our property be tampered with without our consent? One resident demanded. Another chimed in, why did we even agree to these changes in the first place? The atmosphere was electric with indignation. Amid the mounting pressure, the HOA's facade of competence began to crumble. The president's earlier arrogance was replaced with visible anxiety, and the board members exchanged uneasy glances as they fumbled through their justifications. Yet, the real turning point came when a longtime neighbor, someone who had quietly amassed his own pile of documents, stood up and shared his findings. His research confirmed what I already knew: no permits, no proper approvals, nothing. With every piece of evidence laid out, the HOA was cornered and their previous claims dissolved under the weight of facts and municipal regulations. In a dramatic twist that felt straight out of a courtroom drama, I received an official notice from a law office demanding the immediate removal of the unauthorized fiber optic line, along with a warning of severe penalties if the issue wasn't rectified. The tension escalated to such a degree that even the local authorities got involved. One crisp afternoon, as I was meticulously replanting my lawn to cover the unsightly trench marks, 2 police officers pulled up. The HOA president, now desperate to salvage what was left of her reputation, launched into a fervent tirade, accusing me of vandalism and interfering with essential community infrastructure. But the officers, upon reviewing my documents and the evidence, made it clear this was a civil matter. With that, they departed, leaving behind a silence that was both a victory and a cautionary tale. It wasn't long after that, though, that I received another twist, a certified letter, this time accompanied by a check for the full amount listed on my invoice. I remember staring at the check in disbelief, my heart pounding with a mix of triumph and the surreal realization that the battle had been won. The HOA had finally caved in, not out of a sense of justice, but purely out of the necessity to avoid further legal complications and public outcry. But the story doesn't end there. No sooner had I thought the chapter was closed than I discovered that the HOA was attempting to reinstall the very same fiber optic line. I remember that moment vividly. I was out in my yard checking the fence when I saw workers setting up equipment with the same blatant disregard for proper protocol. My blood ran cold. How could they think they could pull the same stunt again? I approached them with the calm determination of someone who had been through hell and back and asked for an explanation. The foreman, clearly rattled, muttered something about a new easement agreement that had been approved by the board. I couldn't help but laugh loudly and incredulously. New easement agreement? I repeated, I never signed anything like that and my property records don't lie. Without missing a beat, I dialed a friend working in city compliance. Within a couple of hours, a municipal inspector arrived at my door. After a brief inspection of the trench and equipment, he confirmed what I had long suspected. The installation was once again in clear violation of city codes, buried too shallow and without the necessary permits. Armed with fresh evidence and backed by city regulations, I confronted the HOA once more. This time, the board was visibly shaken. The inspector's report, coupled with the undeniable fact that my property had been tampered with without my consent, forced the HOA into a corner. In the end, not only did they have to remove the reinstalled fiber line, but they also faced significant fines and a public relations nightmare that would haunt them for years to come. As I wrap up this wild journey, I reflect on the whole ordeal with a sense of both satisfaction and a touch of humor. My yard, once a peaceful retreat, had become the battleground for a David and Goliath story, a battle of wills between an individual standing up for his rights and an overreaching authority that assumed silence equated to consent. And while I may have dug up more than just a fiber optic line, I dug up the truth that sometimes you have to stand your ground, dig a little deeper, and remind people that property rights aren't just words on a document. So, whether you're a homeowner who's ever felt overpowered by HOA regulations or just someone who enjoys a good story of perseverance and clever defiance, remember this: when someone tries to bury their power in your yard, sometimes you have to literally dig it up and maybe send them a hefty invoice along with a knowing smile. Thank you for listening to this crazy tale. I hope it reminded you that no matter how small or insignificant you may feel against a big system, knowledge, persistence, and a dash of rebellious ingenuity can turn the tide in your favor. Stay tuned for more stories, and if you enjoyed this one, hit that like button and subscribe for more Storytime adventures. Happy digging, and always know your rights.